gold is a treasure, and he who possesses it does all he wishes to in this world and succeeds in helping souls into paradise.
Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Welcome to our special, The History of Gold in America. And that quote from Christopher Columbus is the perfect way to start us off today. So we're going to talk all about gold today. Why? Well, first, Biden is proposing and Congress is passing trillion-dollar bills like it's no big deal. Just like we've lost all perception of what a trillion is. And because it's like 2 trillion, we just see the number 2 and we're like, oh, that's not a lot. You know what I mean? Like to our stupid brains, 800 billion sounds way more than 2 trillion. Because, oh, 800 is bigger than 2. Like, no. $1 trillion is a ton of money. And we're just like, oh, here's a $2 trillion spending bill. Here's a $1.9 trillion COVID bill. Here's a $2 trillion climate change bill. And it just came on. You can't do that. This is unprecedented amount of government spending. And the only way there's not enough money to steal from people. You can't tax this. It's not enough. The only way to do this is to print money. And printing money does not create wealth. Printing money destroys wealth. Can't print more gold. And both sides do it. Republicans and Democrats do this. So there's no way it's going to stop on its own. The ship has sailed. The die is cast, whatever cliche you want to use. There's no way to stop the spending. Now, with all the spending, right? So you with me? So it's spending because these people want to get elected, so they give away free stuff. So it's spending, which leads to printing. Printing leads to inflation. It's the only way this can go. And we already see it with many commodities today. And there's no reason why we couldn't one day end up like Zimbabwe. Remember Zimbabwe a couple years ago? They had crazy hyperinflation. We have a picture, that's bread. That's what it costs to buy a loaf of bread. Okay? They printed, we have the bill here. It's like $1 trillion bill. No, it's 100, there it is. It's 100 trillion. Like, what are we doing? That doesn't make, so that's what happens with inflation. That was just a couple years ago. Oh, we're better than them? Oh, we would never have something like that. No. The only way around this is gold. So I want to take some time here today so we can fully understand gold. What is it? What is gold? Why has it been since the dawn of civilization, the form of currency? And why over any other metal? Why gold versus anything else? Is it just because it's pretty? Let's talk about that first. So here's the periodic table of elements, a little flashback here to ninth grade earth science or whatever, ninth grade chemistry class or whatever. There's 96 natural elements on the periodic table, other than those ones way at the bottom, which I didn't do great in chemistry, so I don't know what the deal with those are. But you got 96 natural occurring elements in the periodic table, right? So the question is, which of these elements could you use as currency? All right. Well, you can't use gases as a currency, so that's the right-hand side of the periodic table. You can't use those. You can't use a gas as a currency. You can't use calcium and sodium because they dissolve in water. So that would be a bummer if you had a bunch of money and then it got wet. It goes away. You can't have anything that corrodes in the air, like iron. So you couldn't use iron for money. And once you knock those off, you just 56 of them are gone. So you started with 96, now you have 56, boom, gone. Then you got to get rid of everything that's radioactive. Right? You don't want anything radioactive in your pocket. So you start chipping away at the potential elements that we could use, and you're only left with 5. Rhodium, platinum, palladium, gold, and silver. Well, rhodium and palladium weren't discovered until the 1700s. So that's not going to work in ancient Rome. And platinum, the melting point for platinum is 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can't melt it or form it easily. That leaves us with 2, gold and silver. And that ain't changing. We're going to talk in the next segment about some other properties of gold and silver that make it the perfect precious metal as a store of value and the perfect metal as a medium of exchange. And it's really important to understand the fundamental basics of what it is. It's not just because it's pretty. Also, one of the other important elements of gold is it's scarce. There's not much of it. There's not a lot around. All the gold, if you melted it down, guys, we have the picture of this. If you melted all the gold in the world down, check that out. That's all the gold in the world that's ever been mined would fit inside an Olympic-sized swimming pool. If you melt down all the gold in the world, that's how big it is. That's it. Now, I don't know when you look at that, maybe you're like, oh, that's a pretty big chunk. But then you think, no, wait, that's all the gold in the history of the world. You also got to think 50% of all the gold that we use is jewelry. So 50% is jewelry ever. All the kings and queens of all the years, all the Spanish conquistadors, right? From the Aztecs to ancient kings and queens. All of it, thousands of years. All the gold in Fort Knox. All the gold that's ever existed, melted down, can fit inside a swimming pool? That's it? America's got most of it. Look how pretty that is. America's got most of it. We have twice as much as the number 2 and number 3 countries. Germany's got the second most. Italy has got the third most. We got twice as much because America's awesome. The question is, how much more can be mined? So all the gold that's ever been mined, that picture you just saw a second ago, from the California gold rush, ancient times gold rush, modern mining today, right? And imagine the mining operations that exist today in America and in China. All the gold, there's been mined 190,000 tons. 190,000 tons. It's believed there's only 50,000 tons left that could ever be mined. So we got about 20% more, and that's it. And it's hard to get, right? It's like oil. It's harder and harder to get the more we use. Right? Now, the more expensive gold gets, and it's only going to go up, then, it'll make more financial sense to go and get it, and more technologies will come up that we can go get it easier and stuff like that. But not a lot left. It's the only money that's survived. Think about it. There's been different world currencies, sure. The dollar's only the latest, and certainly won't be the last. Right? Just ask the people of Florence when their currency used to be the world currency, right? Or even the pound, right? I mean, there's always been world currencies. They come and go. Gold has survived thousands of years. Governments always destroy their country's money, just like Zimbabwe. We'll be no different in America. No different than the Weimar Republic in Germany before World War II. Right? We're no better, maybe even worse. Our money will eventually be worth nothing. Why do we think it won't? When you are a student enough of history, and you watch this show enough to know that history repeats itself over and over. There's no reason to believe that it won't repeat itself with money, especially when we're doing the exact same thing that all these governments have done that ultimately destroy their own currency. And you can't go down this road forever. Either we're going to have hyperinflation or some other massive correction to our money supply that's really, really going to hurt. And we're just delaying the inevitable. But gold can't be printed. To people who say it's nothing, then why does the US have so much of it? Why has Russia tripled their gold supply in the last 10 years? Why is China buying as much as they can, and they're pumping out mining operations as fast as they can, and exporting none of it? Why are they keeping all their gold if it's nothing? Human beings haven't changed much in thousands of years. Human nature is the same. And I don't anticipate our desire for gold changing much in our next lifetime either. There's only so much of it. So let's explore what that it is a little more. What is this gold? Why is it important? How do we get some? I want to be like the pirates of old and get my own gold. Peter Marisi is going to be up next from the University of Maryland. He's awesome. He's going to give us some more insight into the history of gold and what properties does it have that makes it such a great store of value that lasts the test of time. The history of gold in America, right here. True story. Mike Slater, glad you're here. Spread the word.
In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There is no safe store of value.
Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special, The History of Gold in America. And we're going to build up to that point from Alan Greenspan there about inflation. But first, I want to go right to our first guest, Peter Marisi. He's a professor at the University of Maryland and also a columnist at the Washington Times and Dow Jones Market Watch. Professor, how are you today, sir?
I'm good. Thanks a lot.
I'm glad you're here. Let's start from the very beginning. What is gold and why is it valuable?
Well, gold has been accepted as money, more or less. It's been put into coins and accepted as backing for money for going back to ancient times. But what you need to bear in mind is that gold is intrinsically valuable because it is scarce. People chose gold because you just can't multiply it. You can't print it in the basement like the Weimar Republic did its paper currency. The Indians in North America, the Northeast Indians, use shell wampum. And the reason for that is that the shells that they could string were extraordinarily scarce. They were only found around the Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island and along the shores in certain places of the Long Island Sound. They were sort of some sort of fish inside the shell. But they were strung together with considerable effort. And so they were scarce. And the Indians came to accept those, much as, for example, in POW camps, cigarettes were accepted because they could not be multiplied. It's what people agree to. Now, in more modern times, people have technology and they can multiply almost anything. And gold has the value or the characteristic that it has purposes. You can use it for jewelry and things like this. And I suspect that's why we gravitated towards gold. It's also worked with some difficulty, but it can be worked. For example, it's worked really like all ferrous metals without heat. You just pound it. So it had a lot of interesting characteristics that made that happen. But it's scarce. It has an underlying purpose. It can be used for jewelry. And so it's never really going to be without value.
Very good. Okay, so when did it really take off as the world's metric for value?
Well, it was always very valuable as soon as people had commerce, because you could exchange stuff for it. I mean, that's why Cortez and the other Spanish explorers came to America to get gold. They weren't interested in opening a large jewelry store in Madrid. They were interested in something that could be swapped around and used to build the Armada, for example. You could use gold to buy what you needed. The Romans paid the army in gold. They weren't decorating their bodies with it. They were using it to live off of. So that's what they did. I mean, basically, one of the reasons the Romans were always sacking other civilizations was to pay off the army. And so the emperor could build his monuments, his colosseums, his forum, and so forth, by paying the construction workers with gold or paying the people that provided the supplies. He used slaves for his construction workers, but he had engineers.
Professor, can you help me understand what the gold standard is? Like, when did we peg our currency to gold, and why is that important? What did that look like?
After the Civil War, we were in what we call the golden age of the international economy. There weren't many barriers to trade. And until World War I, this persisted. And into the 1920s. Essentially, all the major economies of the world, the major governments, backed their currencies with gold. They kept gold in their equivalent of Fort Knox, which meant, for example, if we had a trade deficit, we imported more than we exported. So there was an accumulation of dollars abroad. They could trade those in for gold. But in turn, that would contract the U.S. money supply. And that would cause deflation here, which would lower our prices and cause our exports to increase, imports to decrease and balance things out again. Now, two things caused that system to come apart. One was that it puts a lot of burdens on a deficit country to have to endure deflation. And more importantly, gold is scarce. I mean, a lot of the politics of the Williams-Jennings-Bryan era, the pre-Martin Democratic Party, were fought over the gold standard, whether we should stick to the gold standard because it had a deflationary effect. Because there's just only so much gold in the world. You can't mine it fast enough. After World War II, we tried to recreate it. We basically, the world backed up its currencies with dollars. The dollar was technically backed by gold, but you couldn't get gold for it. But it was technically backed up by gold. And we pegged all the exchange rates to the dollar. You know, the pound was worth so many dollars, the franc was worth so many dollars, and so forth. But they'd still get into those kinds of situations. Trade deficit countries wouldn't have enough dollars. They'd have to devalue their currency, or they'd have to basically deflate their economies. And one by one, we had currency crises in the 1950s and 60s, in the franc and the pound. And ultimately, the dollar became overvalued against everyone else. Jimmy Carter ended the system, more or less, and that was all for the better. And we emerge into our present system of floating exchange rates. Now, the world still backs its currency with dollars. Central banks hold dollars, but we let the currencies float so as to avoid these kinds of imbalances. Of course, there are countries like China that cheat on the system, and that's why there's so much controversy about their currency. They do things to keep it undervalued and basically accumulate dollars.
What's the benefit? And so let me go back a little bit. Can you help? Because you're a professor, sir. You're so good at explaining this stuff. Can you help me understand deflation and how that happens and the problem with that is? And then I guess a corollary to that is, what does that mean exactly that China manipulates their currency or devalues their currency? What does that look like?
There's two things going on. There's two very separate questions. One is, if the Federal Reserve were to gradually reduce the amount of dollars in circulation, just as too many dollars pushes prices up, that would push prices down. That's deflation. So you'd go to the store, and on April 1, a loaf of bread would be $3. The following year, it'd be $2.75, and so forth. Generally, that's happened in Japan in recent decades, and it doesn't work out very well. It's not a healthy environment for growth. I'm not in favor of inflating the dollar the way the Fed is. I mean, they seem to worship inflation over there. To me, no inflation, no deflation would be best. But that's what deflation is. What the Chinese do is they systematically print yuan, buy dollars, which causes their currency to be undervalued in international exchange markets. That gives them a competitive advantage. Their products are artificially cheap. They accumulate dollars that way because they export more than they import, and that's how they're financing their Belt and Road. My feeling is we could fix that, but it's beyond the intellect, it seems, of the Federal Reserve and recent presidents to understand the dangers of the Chinese having so many dollars to buy up influence around the world and finance a navy that threatens Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, most of South Asia, and India. Trust me, if we didn't let them get away with that, they wouldn't have that 200-boat fleet. It has all kinds of profound effects in the machinations of their economy, which permits a relatively poor country still. I mean, China's got a per capita income much lower than ours to spend huge amounts of money on defense.
Yep.
As a footnote, the way the Russians accomplish it is by other means of suppressing the standard of living of their people, so they can afford to mass 100,000 troops on a worthless piece of dirt we call the Ukraine. Not that the Ukrainians are worthless, but they would gain nothing out of capturing a slice of eastern the Ukraine other than rattling the cage of NATO. But that's a story for another day.
Yes, we'll definitely do that again. This is my last question for you, Professor. That Alan Greenspan quote that we played at the beginning of the segment. He said, in the absence of the gold standard, there's no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There's no safe store of value. So what does that mean with the future of gold? Okay, and let me ask this one too. Should people own gold?
What protects us from that is printing too much money. If the Federal Reserve followed the prescriptions of the radical Democrats, with regard to financing their games and schemes. They don't really plan on doing it with the capital gains tax. They're not going to get very much out of that. They admit it, but they feel they can print an infinite amount of money. That's how the Weimar Republic became what it was. It became the Third Reich. It failed on the basis of inflation.
Professor Morisi, University of Maryland. Sir, let's talk again. Appreciate your time.
Peace and goodwill.
And your insight. To you as well, sir. Coming back with more history of gold in America. Spread the word.
There can be no other criterion, no other standard than gold. Yes, gold, which never changes, which can be shaped into ingots, bars, coins, which has no nationality, and which is eternally and universally accepted as the unalterable fiduciary value par excellence.
Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special, The History of Gold in America. And I love that Charles de Gaulle quote. It just talks about just the eternalness of it, right? It's not going anywhere. I want to go right to our next guest, Carol Roth. She got a new book coming out, The War on Small Business, How the Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America, and a former investment banker, the wonderful Carol Roth. Carol, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm so glad you're here. I definitely want to talk about COVID and small business stuff. I want to get back to all that stuff. But let's start from the beginning with Biden and the Democrats and all these spending bills. It's wild, just trillions of dollars being tossed around like it's nothing. How are we supposed to think of that?
Well, you have to think about, just in general, the amount of spending and the amount of money printing over the last decade and a half continues to devalue the dollar, continues to take trust and faith away from our government. I mean, it used to be the government was supposed to protect our property rights and you do a couple of things. But the amount of spending has exploded. Forget about the COVID spending. I mean, just before COVID alone, we had run up I think it was $23 trillion deficit. And then with COVID on top of that, we're now $28 trillion in. When you have that COVID relief money and they say, okay, we're going to issue debt for that, who do you think paid for that? I mean, who across the world paid for that? Nobody paid for that. We went out, the Federal Reserve printed, quote unquote, money, fake money, and then we bought it back from the government. So there's this sort of whole house of cards scenario where we have a Federal Reserve that's getting more and more involved with aiding and abetting the reckless spending of the government, which is creating more concern both within the United States and worldwide about the faith of the dollar.
There's so many things in there that we need to talk about. So I like the idea of the trust. It's eroding our trust in the government. Speak more to that for a minute. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, so if you think about currency, and particularly something what we call fiat currency that isn't backed by anything, I'm sure you've already talked about the fact that the dollar used to be backed by gold, but now it's just backed by the faith of the U.S. government. And the reality is that the government doesn't produce anything, generally speaking. So that means the faith in the economy, as well as the faith for the government to shepherd and protect the dollar. Unfortunately, what they've been doing with outsized spending, with allowing the Federal Reserve to manipulate and get involved in the markets, both on an interest rate perspective and then affecting the money supply, it means that there is less faith in terms of interference in the market and what could be done to the dollar, which is what the whole discussion about money is, right? It's about us all agreeing and coming together and saying that we have faith that this has some agreed upon level of value. And as we know from a supply demand standpoint, if you create a lot more of something, then it becomes less scarce and it has less value. And unfortunately, that's what the government and Fed together have been doing for, as I said, more than a decade.
I want to get back to the Fed in a second, but so this is the one reason why I own gold and silver is because of this very problem here with massive inflation. What are some steps that the government could take to prevent the inflation from coming? Like what could they do? Because the debt is already, as you said, 29 trillion, right? Like what are we even talking about here? So I guess it's twofold. When will it hit? Because it has to. / what can the government do to prevent it from hitting or keep kicking the can down the road?
All right, so when is it going to hit is the $29 trillion and counting question. And I often liken it to driving towards the end of the cliff and saying, well, I haven't fallen off yet. I'm just going to go a little bit further, a little bit further. We don't necessarily know where that edge is, but we know that it's close. And so as we continue to keep pushing closer towards it, at some point you fall off. And if I had that crystal ball, Mike, I would be on a yacht in the Mediterranean right now, not having this conversation with you. You know that it's very likely to happen. We just don't know when. We've seen this in countries around the world, whether it's Turkey or Zimbabwe or whatnot, that have printed tons of money and saw their own currency devalued. Even within the last week, I saw some research that the dollar vis-a-vis other currencies is on the decline. And I've got a paper right here. The Sri Lankan rupee last week was up 1.5% versus the dollar. I mean, what is that all about? So we know that there has been some level of devaluation of the dollar. What we need to do, and I think it's not that Congress doesn't have the knowledge about this, but they lack the courage and the conviction to do this. They need to get spending under control. We cannot continue to run deficits because the only way we finance that is with debt. I mean, frankly, we need a much smaller government that's spending far less. Before COVID, all three levels of government, federal, state, and local, was about $8.1 trillion. That's equivalent to the median household family income on a per household basis. That's insane. They're just spending too much money. So they're aware of this. This is all they care about, the short term and their power. They're not thinking long term because, especially with administrations, those turn over every 4 to 8 years. So, I'm going to get as much power as I can today and let somebody else pick up on the backside. We call that moral hazard when you undertake these decisions, and they're risky, but you're not participating in that risk. And unfortunately, as I said, just no conviction to get this done.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. That's why I have no hope that it'll get fixed, because of the moral hazard and the no skin in the game that you just spoke to, which is why we have to take matters into our own hands. I have an investment question. So when inflation hits, what does that mean for one's stock portfolio? Right? You got all this money in the stock market and inflation hits bad. What does that mean?
Yeah, so, and obviously this is a guesstimate because we're in a situation that's historic and unprecedented, and it depends if the inflation comes with growth or with stagnation, what we call inflation versus stagflation. And given the unprecedented level of Fed intervention in the market that we've never historically seen, both here in the US and in central banks around the world. This is like the biggest debate amongst economists, but there is a lot of thought, particularly with inflation and potentially with some of the policies that are coming down the pike, if something like the capital gains rate increases, that more people will be looking towards hard assets to maintain the store of value. And certainly gold, would be within that range of those hard assets they feel like would retain the value better than something like a dollar, where the Fed and the government is controlling the printing and prints more and distorts the supply and demand.
Yeah. So if I owned, just make something up, $1,000 in whatever, some heirloom, and the inflation goes up, what does that mean for that $1,000? Does that just mean it's not worth as much? Just the same, right? Just the same as if I had
it means you don't have the pricing power. So if before $1,000, might buy you X number of eggs at the supermarket, it means that you're going to buy some fraction of that because each dollar that you have is worth less. I like to think about, I don't know if you remember like Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza back in the day. If you had 100 tickets, you could buy a boombox, and now today you could buy like 3 Tootsie Rolls with your 100 tickets. It's the same concept. That's inflation.
Wow, amazing. Okay, we got like 2 minutes left. What do we need to know about the Fed? You've mentioned it a couple times. It's this very mysterious, secret
Yeah.
society-esque thing that has all this control that I didn't vote for anyone. So what do we need to know about it?
So the Fed is this like really weird quasi-independent, quasi-government agency. The Board of Governors derives their power from Congress, but they are not truly accountable to anyone. They're owned by the reserve banks, but anytime they turn a quote unquote profit on securities that they hold, they pay it back to the Treasury. So it's this cozy sort of banking system, government, kind of cartel, as it's often called. And unfortunately, they are charged with what's called the monetary policy of our country. So something that's kind of not regulated has this implication in terms of they're supposed to hold prices stable, which means not have inflation, and they're also supposed to maximize employment. And kind of like everything else, I mean, I'm a free marketeer. I think that the markets and the invisible hand sort this stuff out much better than central planners, and history has proved that to be the case. But the Fed is the ultimate in central planning. They think they know, based on their tools and the things that they can do in terms of lowering interest rate and changing around the money supply. They think they know how to control inflation and maximize employment. They have already come out and said, well, we know there's going to be inflation, so we're going to let that run a little bit more than we normally would, but we think it's only going to be temporary. The problem is, if they're wrong, once that horse leaves the barn, it's on the road. I'm not sure that they're going to catch up with it. And you should always be very wary of central planners who think that they're smarter than the free markets.
You know what? I've heard a lot about the Fed. I've read a lot about the Fed, but just to call it a central planner, it made it click like never before, right? And as you said, that's never worked ever. Why would we think our central planners over something so important as the money supply and interest rates, we'd be successful at it? We'll fail just like everyone else has around the world. I want to go to your book, The War on Small Business. What is the biggest, gosh, there's social ramifications, but let's keep with the economy today. Biggest economic ramification of these COVID shutdowns that we haven't seen yet. I mean, obviously we know our local mom and pop restaurant that no longer exists anymore, but are there other longer term economic consequences that we haven't seen?
Yeah, I'll just put it in context with the discussion we're having, because there's so many takeaways. But this is this ultimate battle between decentralization and central planning. Unfortunately, over the past several decades, the U.S. has exported capitalism to places like China to the benefit of the Chinese people, and imported central planning to the detriment of the American people. If you think about the concept of free markets, it is rooted in decentralization, and the ultimate in decentralization are these small businesses. They're not the ones who are lobbying and getting special benefits or tax breaks or whatnot from Congress. They're just sitting around and doing their business. Unfortunately, for politicians that are looking to soak up power, that is inconvenient. So whether you think that they are too small to matter or too hard to control, I would argue that both for the politicians, the small businesses, which are the backbone of the economy, end up being an impediment. So what we saw over COVID is they took the opportunity to shut down small businesses, take that money and centralize it, move it to more big businesses, because those are easier to deal with and easier to control. You had 7 tech companies last year that gained $3.4 trillion in value, while the rest of Main Street struggles. And unfortunately, that's the trajectory that we are on long term. If we don't preserve small business, we don't preserve economic freedom in this country.
Wow, beautiful. Well, terrible, but beautifully said. The War on Small Business, How the Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America, by Carol Roth. Carol, super grateful you're here. Thanks for your insight.
Thanks for having me.
Have a wonderful day. Come back with more on the history of gold in America, and we'll talk about how you can get you some. We'll do that next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word.
Bitcoin is not an actual physical coin, and if computers are shut down, you can't buy or sell them. That's why nothing will ever replace gold and silver coins themselves, and all investors should have them at home or in a safe deposit box.
Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special, The History of Gold in America. And now for the grand finale, our culmination, I want to go right to the CEO of American Hartford Gold Group, Sanford Mann. Mr. Mann, how are you, sir?
Mike, how are you doing?
Really good to talk to you again, Sandy. So why are more people buying gold and silver now than ever?
You know, it's really interesting. People buy gold not for what they know. They buy it for what they don't know. And, you know, since Biden has been in office, there's been a lot of question marks. You know, we've printed $8 trillion of cash in the last year. $8 trillion, it's unprecedented. And currently, as we speak, President Biden is presenting a $5 trillion spending plan. Now, the interesting thing is he's proposing this spending plan, and where does that money come from? More printing, higher taxation. So essentially, all of this is bullish for gold, as the value of the dollar will deplete the more money we print and the more we spend.
Has to go that way, right? I mean, we have an unprecedented amount of, as you said, printing and spending, and they're just talking about $1 trillion bills like it's nothing.
Nothing, exactly.
It has to result in inflation and the price of gold going up, doesn't it? How could it go any other way?
We're already seeing inflation. Inflation is here. Inflation right now in the stock market, it's unprecedented. The stock market's up not due to fundamentals, it's up due to inflation. Cheap money was printed, it went into the stock market. We're seeing inflation in the other falling sectors, real estate. Cheap lending has allowed real estate to increase in value. And we're seeing inflation in building supplies. Plywood's up 300% year over year. So inflation is here, it's here.
That's such a good point. All right, so what does that mean for gold? And because I was reading the other day, I think it was Bank of America or someone forecasted $3,000 an ounce, which is like almost double gold today. Who makes these forecasts? What does that mean exactly when they make that forecast?
You know, these investment banks, they're paid a lot of money to be right. Just this morning, ex-JP Morgan managing director, he gave a near-term price projection of silver in the first quarter of 2022, so just less than a year away, between 35 and 40. Bank of America, $3,000 gold. Citibank, well over $2,500 of gold. Near-term projections from UBS and Goldman Sachs is $2,300. So what we're continuing to see is this consensus that gold's going to continue to go higher. And if you want to go down the rabbit hole, there's a lot of price forecasts for the next 3 to 5 years of gold hitting $5,000 to $10,000 an ounce. But what I like to always look at is short-term watermarks. Before we say 5,000, let's get to 2,000. Before we say 10,000, let's get to 3,000. And let's hit these little projections. And the more money they print, the more stimulus, the more inflation, gold's going to continue to go higher.
Do you recommend that people, like, what's the mindset you want people to have? Are people looking to capitalize on that? Are people looking for security, insurance? What's the mindset?
I was at dinner with a group of friends the other day, and they were varying in ages from 45 to 70. And they said, should we be buying gold? Now, here at American Hartford Gold, we believe every American should be diversifying with gold. But the perspective shifts as you age, as you get older. You know, in your 40s, 50s, you're making money. You're setting up your future. You're contributing to an IRA, 401k. When you're 65 or 70 and you've retired, you're now in a protection mode. You're not looking to make money necessarily. You're looking to protect what you have made. So in that instance, gold is a terrific idea. You're not looking to necessarily profit off gold, although in the near term, we've had a lot of clients profit off gold, but you're looking to protect what you worked hard for. So when we look at gold, it's an insurance policy. It's an insurance policy for your portfolio. And the great thing about gold is we sell it in the physical format. Although investors do buy the ETF, the electronic traded version of it, those investors are looking for short-term profit. The investors are looking for long-term protection. They're buying physical gold. And you know, about 6-7 years ago, I was chatting with a client of ours. He was buying gold, and I said to him, he said, you know, you love physical gold. Talk to me about why you like physical gold. And he said to me, he goes, hey, you know, I want to protect my home, so I bought a physical gun. I bought a Smith & Wesson. And he goes, if I'm looking to protect my home, I'm not buying stock in Smith & Wesson. I'm buying the physical gun. And right there, it made sense to me. Right there, it made sense to me. You're not buying an ETF to protect yourself. You're buying to profit. You're buying physical gold to protect yourself.
So I own physical gold and silver. I got two questions. Let's do the silver first, and then I want to ask you about IRAs and 401ks and what that looks like, because that's a little different. So what about silver?
Silver, it was interesting. In the 80s and early 90s, gold had a functional use. It was used in electronics. We used it in various industries. Since the price broke 1,000, 1,500, 1,700, we're seeing it being pulled out of industrial use and replaced with silver. Silver's a phenomenal conductor of electricity. So silver has a two-pronged approach: the investment as a precious metal and the investment as an industrial metal. And we're seeing the world's supply of silver depleting. All these solar panels, all these smartphones, all consume a lot of silver. And currently, it costs more money to go back into recycled silver than reproduce silver. So what we're seeing is silver is continuing to climb for both reasons: the industrial demand and the protection of portfolio and currency devaluation.
Okay, so that's super interesting. What do we do with the 401k, those the IRAs? What does that look like for people?
Absolutely. You know, there's two ways to invest in physical gold and silver for people like me and you. One is you can send in money and you can buy physical gold and silver, have it delivered to your door, put it in a safe at the house, you know, dig a hole in the backyard and put in there. Just make sure you draw yourself your treasure map and leave it with at least one person that you love and trust. The second way is to protect your portfolio inside of your IRA or old 401k. And here at American Hartford Gold, we can help you to set up an IRA and put physical gold, not paper gold, physical gold in your IRA. It's IRS approved, and we can thank Congress in 1997 for enacting that. It allows you to hold physical gold in your IRA. And the great thing is, when you start taking distributions, you take them in gold. You don't take them in cash. And the real interesting thing, and an analogy I use a lot is, Mike, if I put you into a time machine that was going to drop you 10 years into the future, and I gave you two suitcases as options, you could only pick one suitcase. One had $100,000 of cash in it, and one had $100,000 of gold in it. And in this time machine, you're being dropped 10 years in the future, 2031. Which suitcase would you take with you?
Gold.
Why would that be?
I reckon it'll be worth more with the inflation going up. That cash won't be worth as much.
And that's an easy fundamental to grasp. So when we look at our retirement accounts, that you're looking to take money out of this 10 years in the future, 5 years in the future, 15 years in the future, would you rather have cash or would you rather have a physical commodity like gold or silver?
Interesting.
And so in an IRA, it makes sense as part of a diversification strategy, not all your eggs in any one basket.
Very good. Okay, so there's a lot of gold companies that exist. Why should I call American Hartford Gold Group above the others?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm an educated consumer. I call 2 or 3 companies anytime I'm looking to do anything financially in my life. American Hartford Gold is a great option. We've been around for a while. We've delivered over $500 million in gold and silver. The number one question our clients or prospective clients ask when they call us is, will I actually get gold and silver from you? So trust is a huge factor. Trust is a huge factor. You want to be with a company that has a history, a legacy of delivering gold and silver. And not only buying gold and silver from them, but what about when you or your loved one or your beneficiary wants to sell the gold or profit take in the future? See, American Hartford Gold, we don't charge any fees when you liquidate your gold back to us. And we've never turned down a consumer from American Hartford Gold who's bought gold from us to sell back to us. We have an A+ rating with Better Business Bureau. You know, we have the likes of Bill O'Reilly, Rudy Giuliani, who are not only spokespeople for us, but they're also clients of ours. We're affiliated with NASCAR. We have a car that runs in the NASCAR races every year. I mean, I can go on and on about this, but we've really built a legacy based on trust with our clients.
Yeah, I like the idea that when you want to sell it, you can sell it back to you guys. You're not stuck with anything. I don't think you can ever be stuck with gold. But if you ever want an escape plan, you guys will buy it back at the price. I think that's awesome. And now, everyone watching now, you now know the CEO of American Hartford Gold Group, Sanford Mann. Mr. Mann, appreciate your time, brother.
Mike, really good talking to you as always. You do great work.
Thanks, man. We'll do it all again. Sanford Mann, American Hartford Gold Group. And there's our special, The History of Gold in America. Spread the word.